Hi, thank you all so much for joining us this morning. I am Erica Mullen. I am the co-director of PIN. This is Cleary Larkin, the director. So I am going to be acting as the MC for today. As you know, we have been looking for New Guinea this summer. You're going to hear a lot more about what that entailed and what we have found. I just want to tell you a little bit about how we looked for New Guinea. So what do Simone Biles, Eric Hayden, and Michael Jordan, and this group of students all have in common? Any thoughts? I wish they were all University of Florida. That would be great. No, they all have the ability to take something incredibly difficult and make it look easy, simple, and effortless. But my job is to tell you that this research was not effortless, and I want to show you a little bit about what it entailed. So the students started by having to learn all about Nantucket's overall history, the preservation work that happens on the island, the general history of both the island and this very specific neighborhood, what existing research already existed. So this meant they had to read books like Away Offshore by Nat Philbrick and The Other Islanders by Fran Kartunen, who I saw earlier. It also meant that they needed to do things like participate in the Juneteenth events and tour the historic colored cemetery. They viewed Fran and Barbara White's film, Nantucket's Historic Colored Cemetery, Stories Told by Nantucketers. So they also had to tour the Whaling Museum. They had to learn to identify architectural elements and the landmarks found on this island. They had to learn how to use the NHA archives. And all of these things happened in the first 2 weeks that they were here. So what happened next? To really understand New Guinea and to look for New Guinea, we worked with 2 local experts without whom we would have really been lost this summer. Betsy Tyler spent weeks taking small groups of students to the town's Registry of Deeds office, which if you haven't been there, it's a pretty tiny, pretty confined space. But in total, she and the groups of students spent about 130 hours in the deeds office, hauling these very large books and straining to read 18th and 19th century cursive, which is probably a real challenge for some of our younger students. The groups also spent about 30 hours combing through the archives of the NHA. All of this was in addition to the online research that they were already doing outside of this. Marcia Fader and Cleary Larkin walked about 20 miles with the students, all without leaving the neighborhood. Marcia taught them all about the architecture of Nantucket, how to analyze the buildings, and what buildings can tell you when the paper trail of research really runs cold. She and Cleary also introduced the students to the joys of the hospital cafeteria for lunch, the hot place in our neighborhood. In addition to the deeds and the architectural studies, the students also pulled from a wealth of existing research that has happened in this neighborhood. And all of this research has really been compiled by them for you all, and it will be available through our website on their story maps. And you're gonna hear a lot about their story maps as they present to you. And at the end, I'm gonna actually put up a link so that you can access our story maps as well. But we wanted everything kind of in one spot, so it's easy for you, the community, to access. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Cleary Larkin, who's going to really lay the foundation for which this neighborhood analysis will be built.
It is just incredible to see this room full. Yeah. And I think it means that this project is really important to Nantucket. So this project began last fall with a CPC grant to study an area historically called West Monomoy. The project is in partnership with the town of Nantucket as part of a larger survey plan to document historic resources across the entire island. A 2022 study by Powell Consulting identified 59 separate areas for research and documentation to assist with the town's historic preservation process. The basic fact is you can't advocate for preservation if you don't know anything about a site's historic or cultural significance. And so few of our resources on the island have actually been fully documented. So far, only 3 other areas in the plan have been surveyed or are in the process of being surveyed. Fish Lots, just north of our study area, Brant Point, and Sconset. West Monomoy was listed as a high priority due to its connection to the historic African American community and due to the threat of losing historic resources in the area from infill development and applications for demolition. The survey goal is to identify which of the buildings in the area were constructed pre-1976. This date coincides with the period of significance, the end of the period of significance, as listed in the 2012 revision to the National Historic Landmark designation. Those pre-1976 buildings are considered historic and need a Massachusetts Historical Commission Form B, which records the building's information on location, date of construction, architect or builder, character-defining features, and alterations. The architectural description and historic narrative build the case for significance of the building, which can be used by the town and the HGC for review. We started the West Monomoy project last summer. We made a trip here in November to perform an initial reconnaissance survey and hold a community workshop to hear stakeholder stories of the neighborhood. And thank you all for coming back to learn more, because I see many familiar faces in the room. We began archival research to understand the historical context of the neighborhood and in preparation for this course. And here we are to present our progress, and it is only progress. It is not the final. We're presenting our progress to you, and we want to ask you for your feedback. This is really considered our second community engagement meeting for this grant. I just want to point out on the wall, you see a bunch of our brainstorming over the semester. I'd like you to brainstorm with us too. Today, if we're missing something, if you have a story to tell or something to share, take a marker, write it on the wall, and we will be in touch with you. This is a really complex area, and we need all input that we can gather. And this research is really just beginning. This fall, Erica and I will run what we call quality control to confirm all the information the students have found so far. We're going to continue our research and writing up a neighborhood context statement and take more oral history. So we will be back. If you have something to share, let us know. We'd love to get in touch with you. Lastly, we're going to be creating a geospatial database, and this is going to be for the town and for the public use to access this survey information. Our next steps will be an application for a second grant to create the Form Bs, potentially 250 of them, and possibly continuing research into another PIN summer. Which brings us to this summer, looking for New Guinea. We have 3 research questions. Which buildings were constructed pre-1975 so that we can count how many we need to do Form Bs for? We have 345 properties that we looked at this summer. 34 of them had had previous research completed. About 86 were post-1976, so we haven't touched those yet. We started and completed 218 of them. We didn't complete all 218, but we at least started 218 properties. And we didn't actually get to 7 of the ones that we needed to, but I think those are okay numbers. What's the neighborhood identity? How many of you in the room have heard West Monomoy and knew where it reflected? Some of you, but not a lot. It's not a name that's heard a lot. I think more typically you might know Newtown, New Guinea, near Town Gate, Five Corners, back of town, or probably even more recently, the Portuguese neighborhood. Why were these names used in certain periods? How do we take 300 years of history in one neighborhood and call it by one name? I don't think we do. How can we connect the social and cultural history to place? This is really our Looking for New Guinea project. Previous research has created lists of Black residents with names likely familiar to you all. We have the list of the names in the historic colored cemetery. We have the Kaldenbach-Montemayor database. We have so many lists of names in this neighborhood. Can we connect those names to land or buildings, providing better insight into who lived here and when? I'm going to quickly provide you with an overview of the study area. We studied 17 blocks, 345 properties. The boundaries were determined in part by this survey area plan. So if you start at the star, that's 5 corners. You work your way up Pleasant, over Silver, down Orange a little bit, over to Weymouth, to Union, down Union to the curve we all recognize at Consus Spring, where it intersects back with Orange, down Orange all the way to Bear Street, over to Bear, back up to Pleasant, Williams Lane, Prospect Avenue, and York Street. It's a huge study area. The known landmarks around this area really are the historic colored cemetery shown on the left behind the Cottage Hospital, the African Meeting House at 5 Corners, and the Boston Higginbotham House. That's it. Those are the 3 known landmarks that we know from this time period. Interestingly, we already identified that we're missing one part of our study area, and that's that 5th corner of Mill Hill. How do you have 5 corners and create a boundary that doesn't include that? That Mill Hill history is going to be related to this area. So that's a future research question for us. This is the 1726 plat of West Monomoy. That's where that name comes from. Again, notably familiar is that curve where Union meets Orange at Consus Spring. And so the plat ran from Union, Orange, and to Pleasant Street on the west. When we take it and rotate it and we put it over our study area, you can see we're missing a lot of information. We stop at Bear Street. West Monomoy actually continues past the Springs. So that's more research for us to do as well. Also, it stops at Pleasant Street. So we have these 3 blocks, our O, P, and Q blocks, if you will. We think that is really where New Guinea has been identified. And so it's interesting to me that we have this West Monomoy survey area, and we have New Guinea considered as a part of that, even though it wasn't on the plat. But we think this is really strongly connected to that period of New Guinea. And so how do we know this? Our preliminary deed analysis looked for the names West Monomoy, New Guinea, and Newtown. For West Monomoy so far, okay, we've only gone back to like the early 1800s. Some of them have gone back a little bit further, but this is just preliminary. So far, we have found 21 properties that were deeded between 1757 and 1813. And you can see those properties coincide exactly with the West Monomoy plat. So far, New Guinea only has 8 properties that list that phrase on its deeds. The majority of them are on Atlantic Avenue, which is noted on the 1833 map as New Guinea. It's also interesting to note that this name comes into use so far at 1821, and it continues today through 2016 deeds. Most surprisingly, Newtown had the most properties with the name listed on the deeds so far. And these are all over our study area and as early as 1763. So perhaps we need to be thinking more about how to define Newtown. As we transition into the students' work assessing the development of the area, I want to point out that the use of maps to study the neighborhood evolution has been critical to our conclusions so far. The 1833 coffin map is the earliest that shows our area. You can see it's relatively unsettled, with a few buildings along Atlantic or New Guinea and Orange Street, and a really informal street pattern. 5 Corners, where the star is, isn't fully even developed yet. By 1940, the aerial still shows relatively sparsely developed land parcels, and we can see the adjacencies to surrounding rural and agricultural areas. Which leads us to our assessment of the neighborhood as it stands today. Again, this is preliminary, but we're seeing some patterns and trends here. Today, the neighborhood is almost 100% built out, with the majority of new construction happening in the 20th century. We have lost much of the early historic resources in the area, with the early half of the 19th century architecture being the strongest representation of what used to be here. For me, the presence of so much new construction signals that we have much more work to do to understand what these parcels looked like pre-1800. Just because it isn't there now doesn't mean it didn't exist at all. With that, I'd like to hand it over to the students for specific case studies and themes of our study area. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Linda Lyons. I am somebody's grandmother and a fourth-year PhD student at the University of Florida. The title of this project is called Spatial Mapping of Segregation, and I just want to say that it came about organically as we were looking at maps in our study area, particularly this one block that you'll see. It's in the Five Corners area, bounded by Silver and Westover streets to the north and south, and Orange and Pleasant Street to the east and west. The pin drops that you see identify the higher and lower zones of that residential block. We're looking at how the topography of the area may have influenced the community. This is the 1848 Bosch survey map showing the changes in elevation of the land by the hatch marks that are highlighted in yellow. Represented by the green circle is Mill Hill, which is the highest point in the area. So any water runoff would have naturally flowed downhill towards the study area. You can also see that Fair and Pine Streets dead end into Silver Street, and there's a big drop off there that would have contributed to this flood zone. This is the USGS historical topographical map from 1945. So it's completed almost 100 years after the Bosch survey map. The yellow circle specifically denotes that lower depression on our case study block. As a point of reference on this map, the red pin drop is 14 Silver Street. This 2014 FEMA flood map of the town shows the primary area that's subject to flooding in blue as the land that surrounds the Nantucket Harbor, as you would expect. The secondary area in brown that's adjacent to the flood zone is, of course, right there by the water, but you can see that it skips a big area, and then all of a sudden there's another brown circle on this block that we've been looking at. So why is this area a flood zone? We don't know yet. You're going to help us. This is the 1858 Walling map. It's on our case study block and names the town residents that live there in our area. So the question that evolved organically after examining all these study maps is it possible that the topography of our case study block, particularly the flood zone, manifested itself as a natural contributor to the segregation of the block? Because you'll see, I've separated the names of those who lived on Silver Street and those who lived on Orange Street. And in a comparison, the families that lived on Orange Street were white, prominent families, and their houses are still standing. If you look at the houses on Silver Street, there's 2 that have been demolished and 1 that was recently threatened with demolition as well. All 3 of the residences that we're talking about belong to families of African descent. So the 4 residences on Orange Street are typical Nantucket houses. You've probably passed them a lot in your travels. The yellow house is a Greek revival that belonged to Joseph P. Sylvia. He was a European immigrant from the Azores. The small cottage, designated by the Red Heart because I love it, is 14 Silver Street. It's the only residence remaining on this block that belonged to an African-American mariner named Jacob Jones, who was born in Maryland. As the last house standing representing the people of color on our case study block, I thought I'd dig a little deeper into his story. So he's listed as a mariner on the recorded deed when he purchases his little house in 1826 for $339. But only 2 years later, he advertises his services as a chimney sweep, and his wife, Diana, he's going to hire her out as a maid. The following year, in 1829, he's looking for work as a house painter. And then he shows up again in the 1850 census, and he's working as a fisherman. And he has a son that's a mariner. They also have a boarder living with them at this time, Joseph Antoni, who is a black mariner from Cape Verde. In the 1855 census, Jacob is listed as a laborer. He's buried in the colored cemetery in 1859. But we look at the shifts in his occupations as evidence of a changing economy on Nantucket as the whaling industry declines. However, much more research is needed on Jacob Jones and his life on Nantucket to understand his journey. This, again, is our Walling map. At this time, the slide shows the residences of African-American homeowners that are represented on the map. It's important to note, however, that we may not have identified all the homeowners at this point in our study, and we have not been able to research the people of color that may have been renters at this time yet either, so more work to do. Represented by the gold stars on the map are the churches in the area, and the red star is Five Corners. The two churches were built in 1825 and 1835. So apart from our topographical-based hypothesis, is it also possible to think that people simply desired to live close to their congregations? They were an important source of religious education and support, and they served as a social gathering place too. We've been talking about the segregation that may have occurred on our case study block. However, as workers in the whaling industry, people of color were integrated into the ship's crews, paid fair wages, and were accepted and respected for their skills. In 1850, Eunice Ross lived with her family on Silver Street, and she's known for her struggle to integrate the high school in Nantucket in 1840. She eventually won that battle with the support of her community. It took more than 100 years for the rest of the United States to catch up to Nantucket's school integration policy when the landmark Supreme Court case of Brown versus the Board of Education declared state-sponsored segregation in public schools unconstitutional in 1954. There's also evidence that the Ross family home on Silver Street eventually became a boarding house that was racially integrated. So I was left with more questions than answers by the end of this thought process, and so we would really like your help. Mostly I'm just thinking, did that bottom of the hill, that wet zone, that topography make the land less desirable? Therefore, was it less expensive? Or was it just land that was available the closest to town? Or again, were they gathering near their churches? Were racial lines drawn when it came to housing in Nantucket? It's okay on the ships, but maybe not in our neighborhoods. So if you have any thoughts or information to contribute to the subject, please find me after the presentation. I would love to hear from you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am Sullivan Morris. I'm an undergraduate student at Liberty University, and today I'm going to take a few minutes to dive into the topic of 20th century subdivision and infill. The research question guiding this topic is, how has the density of the West Monomoy area changed historically? I will be focusing on a case study of a specific piece of land that was historically owned by the Azorian Perry family as an example of this infill. For spatial understanding, the study area that was assigned to me at the beginning of the summer is just south of Five Corners between Atlantic Avenue and Pleasant Street. These streets, as well as a star for the Five Corners area, will be on all further maps and graphics. I want to start with a comparison of the block density over time from 1833 to 2013, when the last major dwelling was added to this block. In less than 200 years, you can see how dramatic of an increase the development has been. As a note, some of the buildings on the 1833 map have been demolished, removed, or replaced, but new dwellings were added to generally the same location. So for this study, I am looking at new building locations, not necessarily new buildings. In the context of this research, 1975 marks the difference between historic and modern buildings. So I am using data from 1975, even though the aerial image in the middle is from the 1960s. It's just better quality than anything that we have from the 70s. Historically, infill was slow and steady. There was only an increase of 15 dwellings in a span of 142 years, which is a 0.61% annual increase. In the modern era, infill rapidly picks up. In only 38 years, the number of dwellings on the block nearly doubled, which is a 1.73% annual increase. A visual representation of this change in infill rate is shown. So again, 15 dwellings in 142 years compared to 24 dwellings in only 38 years is a huge difference. Much of this infill happened within the outlined area, which is the property that historically belonged to the Perry family. This makes the Perry land an excellent example of the late 20th century block infill that was occurring on the island. This zooms in on the Perry family land with the top half of the slide showing the family tree of the Perry family and the generations of landowners. The first landowner was Joseph Perry. He was born in the Azores and moved to Nantucket in 1889. He married Flora Thomas, a Nantucket native with Portuguese heritage, in 1892, and a year later, they purchased a tract of land between Pleasant Street and Atlantic Avenue. It was not this whole property, it was just the northern half of it, and they built a dwelling in 1893 and a barn in 1900. They purchased the rest of the land in 1905. In 1929, they portioned off some of their property and sold it to their son Alfred T. Perry and his wife Marion, who built a house in 1942. In 1972, a fourth dwelling was constructed, and in 1973, the large property was passed through Alfred C. Perry to his brother Joseph E. Perry and Joseph's wife Madeline. In 1982, Joseph and Madeline sold the undeveloped land to the Nantucket Building Company. In 1984, Marion sold her property to Joseph and Madeline, and in 1987, they turned around and sold the developed land to the Nantucket Artists Association. The Nantucket Building Company subdivided and sold the land, and houses were built in 1982, 83, 94, 96, and 2001. The Artists Association also subdivided and sold the land and added a cottage in 2013. So as you can see, much of this block has been developed in the 80s and 90s and even into the 21st century, with only 4 of those dwellings being historic, and even the 4th dwelling was on the cusp of being in the modern era. A good comparison and contrast of this development is the Perry family and the Phelan family. Both of these families held land in this block generationally, but there's a huge contrast. The Perrys in red, as mentioned, came into ownership of their land in 1893, and the Phelans in blue came into ownership of their land in 1841. In the 1980s, the Perry family sold their land, it was subdivided, and majorly developed. There was a building boom in the 1980s on the island, so the Perrys may have seen and taken advantage of an opportunity to move elsewhere on the island, which they did. Contrarily, the Phelan land is still in their family, with several members in ownership and joint stewardship of the land. While the rest of the block was filling in, this land stayed within the family and remained relatively unchanged, with a few exceptions for dwellings being added to accommodate for a growing family. The land has clearly not seen development like the Perryland and the rest of the block. It is evident that these families took different approaches to their land in ways that they saw were best to accommodate themselves, their values, and future family members. Besides the Phelan land, these are some other properties in our study area that have not been developed like the rest of the neighborhood, and I have included the owners of these properties. Linda just spoke on topographical reasons why the land south of Silver Street might not be developed, but it is definitely an area for further research as to why these other properties have not been. To review, my research question has been, how has the density of the West Monomoy area changed historically? I have found, primarily in my block, that rapid infill has occurred in modern times compared to a steadier increase historically, and this lines up with what we already know. The next steps I would recommend are to examine the density change throughout the West Monomoy area and connect contributing factors. A second, to determine the reasons for large land parcels that are not developed. And a third, to compare the current situation of other historical family land holdings.
I'm Grace Kirkpatrick. I am a student at UMass Amherst studying landscape architecture and community development.
And I'm Nicolette Renbarger. I'm a first-year PhD student in historic preservation at the University of Florida. Today, we're going to talk about the different architectural typologies that we have found across our blocks. This diagram shows the overview of the quantities of the different architectural styles that we have identified so far. We have the typical Nantucket house, 1.5 and 1 3/4 story houses, eclectic Victorian, bungalows, a style that we're calling transitional minimal, and the unique homes with rusticated block foundations. Starting with the typical Nantucket style, this is one of the oldest houses styles that we have found on our blocks, typically built between the 1780s and 1850s. They're characterized by being a 2.5-story dwelling with a simple exterior facade resembling simple Quaker values. They are built for function and durability. Some of the character-defining features include a central chimney for heating and cooking. As you can see in the plan drawing, this chimney has 3 flues and services different spaces. The houses have a symmetrically balanced facade with minimal exterior decoration. They feature a gable roof with the ridgeline parallel to the street. The plank frame windows are typically 6/6 or 12/12. And these houses we found most predominantly on Orange Street and Union Street of our study blocks. Next, we have the 1.5-story house. Another early architectural style. These can be identified by their efficient, compact size. This style was common among the early middle-class residents. Its character-defining features include a gable roof with the ridgeline also parallel to the street. It has a short eave line just above the first floor windows and under that roof line. They have a partial second floor with small upper windows, and it also has a functional central chimney with typically 3 bays across on the exterior facade. This style, the 1 3/4 story house, is the most commonly found in our study blocks. I believe so far we've surveyed 55 of them. They are predominant along the east side of our blocks. Typically constructed around the 1830s. This style is differentiated by the longer eave line on the front facade, and this allows for more livable space on the second floor, more functional. These were so prevalent in our study area that it raises the question if they were speculative or from a pattern book or some kind of plan book. Here we are comparing what I mean by the gable end facing versus gable ridge facing the street. In the left example, you can see Greek Revival influence through more decorative exterior ornamentation. The front facade also has clapboard siding, which is more formal, a formal material specifically for the public-facing side of the home. This often showed prominence and wealth among the early residents. The example on the right has the ridgeline parallel to the street. It has simple ornamentation on the exterior, which suggests that it is probably older than the Greek Revival example. And then here you can also begin to see the evolution of the lean-to style. These are showing the differences between, on the far left, you have a simple elevation of a front door surround. It has a transom window, which is very functional, transom, transfer of light, compared to the Greek Revival door elevation that has a lot more decoration. It has a large entablature. It has pilasters on either side. A big key defining characteristic of this style, you'll see more so in the study field, the example doesn't show it the best, but the pilasters are tapered. And that was a big telling sign for us when trying to identify these houses. And then the window examples show just a traditional, typical window, very simple. And then as you get to the Greek Revival, you have a splayed lintel at the top. It's the top horizontal piece where the edges kind of taper in a little bit. And that was a big key defining feature of that style as well. And then lastly, inevitably on all of our blocks, the majority of our properties had additions or modifications over time, like you can see in the isonometric view. Different roof styles, different dormer types. You have the hip dormer on the top, the gable to the left, and the shed dormer to the right. The example of the brick foundation is unique in showing that older brick was handmade. It's very irregular in shape and size. And then change over time, this home had some kind of repair, and now you can see brick is man-made. It's a much more uniform in style, and just further shows us like the change over time that evolved in our areas.
Okay, I'm going to bring us closer to our contemporary times up into the 20th century. So, hang on. Okay, well, this is fine. So this is an eclectic Victorian style house, which might be my personal favorite. There's not a lot of these that we've identified in our study area, only 3, but they're really identifiable and you can really spot them from a mile away. So they're generally 1.5 to 2 stories with that really steeply pitched gable roof. And so they have this ornamentation that is officially called scroll sawn verge boards and wood ornamentation, but I always knew it as gingerbread. They'll have the pointed arch, decorative windows, bays, dormers, nice porches. And I think one of the big key defining features of this is they are so much more decorated with so much more ornamentation than those earlier Nantucket styles we see. So we're starting to see a departure from that Quaker influence to a more contemporary style. So this particular home that you're seeing on our screen is 65 Pleasant Street, which Marcia has done a lot of work on. And it's really interesting because this started out as a colonial revival style with later additions to turn it into this eclectic Victorian style. And as you can see, this is a diagram from Marcia, and all the different colors indicate different additions, different time periods. So this house has evolved a lot since its original construction. Now moving on to the bungalow, which is about more 1900 to 1940. We've so far identified 19 of these in our study area, so quite a bit more than the eclectic Victorian. These are generally 1 to 1.5 stories with a really low-pitched hip or gabled roof, as you can see, super different than the eclectic Victorian. They have these wide overhanging eaves with these really deep, generous porches. And sometimes you'll see that these porches are now enclosed into 3 season rooms or entry spaces. And we often see grouped windows and kind of more of a craftsman style. We generally see these in the southern and western portions of our study area, which is further away from like the historic downtown. One further research question we have about these is on Atlantic Ave, we noticed that we have 2 bungalows side by side that look very similar, potentially a Sears catalog. So we would like to look into that a little bit more. And now the name we are debuting today, which is Nantucket Transitional Minimal. And so if anyone has any other thoughts on the name, feel free to let us know, but this is a big moment in Nantucket architectural history. So we've identified 14 of these in our study area. And again, they're generally more towards the southern and western portions, which we're starting to notice might be the newer developments. So this is really more mid-20th century middle-class housing. As you can see, it has a very simple floor plan. It's only 1 story, kind of a smaller footprint. Sometimes we see an asymmetrical facade, but generally asymmetrical or symmetrical, it's very balanced. It has a very modest appearance, a modest entry, flat, unembellished trim, and very simple windows. And so this style is indicating a shift to more modest scale middle-class housing. And now, not quite a style, but a feature that we wanted to talk about are rusticated block foundations. So we are still looking for these. We've only found a few. So if you see anything like this in West Monomoy, let us know. So this is a type of concrete block that you can see is that really textured face, so very different than a flat, typical concrete. And what's really important about this is that it can really help us date buildings because it was used during a very specific time period of the late 1900s to early 20th century. And it's a very common in bungalows and vernacular structures. So the image on the right is a house in our study area with this type of block. And another interesting thing is that we believe that this block was either made or manufactured and stored on 28 York Street, which is kind of right in the heart of our study area. So in conclusion, this is just so far what we have. We're still looking, but we have at least 17 typical Nantucket houses, at least 5 1.5-story houses, at least 35 1 3/4 houses with that ridgeline parallel to the street, at least 20 with the end facing the street, only 3 eclectic Victorians, but we'll keep looking, 19 bungalows, and then at least 14 Nantucket transitional minimals. So why are we talking about this? Understanding these architectural typologies helps us understand who lived here historically, what the economic and social conditions and changes were like, and what people valued at the time, because we can understand that based on the architecture. So we have some further research questions, like are new builds today contributing to the existing character of our study area? Are they responding to that neighborhood context, or are they just trying to meet the building with Nantucket in mind guidelines? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ellie Reinhart. I just got my master's in architecture at Clemson University.
Hi, everyone. I'm Isabella Gonzalez. I'm a Tishman Fellow with the Preservation Foundation of Palm Beach.
Hi, I'm Linda Lyons, and we're old friends, so I won't say all the rest again. We're going to present to you some of the people who are responsible for building our community. So the architecture on Nantucket has been shaped by the many residents that designed, constructed, and preserved the unique built environment here on this island. In the following presentation, we'll introduce to you some of those architects, builders, and tradespeople that are named here on our outline. These were influential people on the island from the early 1800s through the 20th century. We identified these professional practitioners and craftsmen through our research at the Town Deeds Office, and it's a smelly room, you forgot to say that, and with the help of the Nantucket Historical Association and access to their extensive archives, which we appreciate so much. The first builder we'll talk about is John B. Nicholson. We've identified 13 houses in our study area that he either built and or lived in. He was a prolific house carpenter that was active in Nantucket during the 1830s and 1840s. His father, Isaiah Nicholson, was also a house carpenter, indicating that this was a generational profession for the Nicholson family. He was known for his craftsmanship and his involvement in speculative real estate development, frequently purchasing the land, constructing the homes, and then selling them himself. He was a one-man show. At this point, research indicates that he was responsible for owning more than 70 properties on Nantucket during this period. His work helped shape the physical fabric of the community, and he contributed to the growth of our neighborhood. Nicholson's impact is still visible today in the form of surviving homes that are representative of Nantucket's architectural history. The houses here on Orange Street were built by Nicholson. I have unofficially named them the Sisters. They're notable examples of the vernacular house type that's known locally as a typical Nantucket house. The house's exterior design is characterized by an asymmetrical facade, paneled front door set within a pilaster door surround, window cases with splayed wooden lintels, and a raised entry, often with side-facing stairs. Here are two more of the other Orange Sisters here, the Little Sisters. They're pictured in the 1830s, and then again, how they are right now in 2025, showing their current condition. Other than the addition of shutters and a roof walk on 77 Orange, you can see that the Sisters have been accurately preserved and are looking pretty good for 190 years old. Pictured are number 2 and number 8 New Street. You can see that they have very similar floor plans and exteriors, just like the Orange Street houses also had similar floor plans and facades. This makes me speculate that John Nicholson might have had a book of house plans from which people were able to choose their future homes, or, and maybe more likely, he typically constructed spec houses and then repeated the layout and design to build more efficiently.
Thank you, Linda. Now I'm going to speak on Richard Lake Coleman. He was a prominent late 1700s Nantucket housewright builder from an original family of the English settlers here in Nantucket and builder's descendant of Thomas Coleman. He constructed several homes in our study area, including 88 Orange Street in Newtown, listed in the deeds, 102 Orange Street, 21 Union Street. He worked in the colonial revival style, and his style is marked by the symmetry, gambrel roofs, and classical details. Around 1801, he built the 1800 house on Mill Street, later selling it at a premium to High Sheriff Jeremiah Lawrence, highlighting the status and quality. He also did this at 88 Orange. Coleman's work reflects early urban development, evolving architectural trends, and difficult at the time as a master builder, and a lasting family legacy in Nantucket's building trades. Next is William F. Codd. He briefly owned property in New Guinea and played a key role in Nantucket's development in the late 1800s. He was a skilled engineer, surveyor, and planner. He helped shape the town's layout, designing roads, lots, public spaces, and infrastructure. Codd worked also for the Wannacomet Water Company, helping expand the island's water system, and was active in civic life, regularly contributing to town planning. And his legacy lives on in Nantucket streetscapes, infrastructure, and through the work also of his pioneering daughter, and even access to the water we drink today. His daughter, Eliza F. Codd, was one of Nantucket's earliest female architects and preservationists, working in the colonial revival style. Trained at MIT, she broke barriers in a male-dominated field and carried on her family's legacy of community-minded building. Though not directly tied to New Guinea, her work deeply impacted Nantucket's early 20th century architecture. Eliza supported local welfare, and her funeral was attended by many in the building trades. Her contributions opened doors for women in architecture, and more research is fully needed to fully document her legacy.
All right, so, a little taller. During the 1950s and 60s, architect H. Errol Coffin lived in our study area on 4 Weymouth Street. And while he might be known here as one of Nantucket's preservationists and architects, his story actually begins in the state of New York. Coffin graduated from Cornell University in 1913, and his brother Kenneth shortly followed in his footsteps, graduating in 1917. The two brothers opened the firm Coffin and Coffin Architects in New York. They had the firm for about 50 years and were really well known for their school design, both locally and internationally. In 1956, Coffin made the move to Nantucket, where he had deep family ties. He lived here on 4 Weymouth Street, which is a 1 3/4 story house, as we were taught in the previous presentation, and he lived here until he passed away in 1969. As I said, he was heavily involved in the preservation of Nantucket. He served on multiple organizations, including the Historic Districts Commission and the Historical Associations Council. While his work is not directly tied to our study area, it is still crucial to the town of Nantucket, including the preservation of the Jared Coffin House and the White Elephant restoration. He also was involved in newer construction. He was responsible for the addition to Nantucket High School and also the addition to the Whaling Museum that houses the whale skeleton that we all know and love. Earlier in the summer, I was lucky enough to be part of an interview with Coffin's granddaughter, Elizabeth, and she just spoke so highly of his school design, which I think highlights his lasting impact on both his family and the town of Nantucket. Clay Lancaster was an architectural historian and preservationist in the late 20th century, whose work also shaped how we understand Nantucket's built environment today. From 1971 to 1978, he lived in our study area on 9 Beaver Street, which is also a 1 3/4 story house, which he was able to really immerse himself in the community while conducting detailed field work. He is really well known, especially in this area, for his 1972 book on Nantucket architecture, which really brought attention to the island's vernacular buildings, especially in underrepresented neighborhoods like West Monomoy. What made his work stand out was the way he combined architectural analysis with a sense of place. He really taught you about the buildings, but also taught you about the people behind them, those who built and lived in the homes. And I think, as a lot of us in the room can agree on, his research continues to inform preservation efforts today and remains a foundation for a lot of the island's architectural education.
Next, we're going to move on to Nantucket's 19th century homes that were built by the skilled tradespeople in the area at the time. They were carpenters, masons, blacksmiths, housewrights, and even merchants. We so far have identified 15 craftsmen with locations and dates of residence in our study area. So carpenters constructed and maintained the homes. Masons added to the durability and architectural style with the rusticated block concrete foundations, as we heard from earlier, which was even found in our area storage location and creating it at 28 York Street. And blacksmiths provided essential tools and hardware. Alan Smith, who's pictured here, was a significant landowner and likely an early developer in the area. So more research is needed to really know and investigate his trades, his investments, and how the urban development played out. Many craftsmen likely learned their skills through apprenticeship, family ties, local hands-on experience, and skills have been passed down through families, neighborhoods, and generations. Further research is also needed on the contributions from communities of color in the local trades. Last but not least, why do builders matter? Well, we're honoring Nantucket's creative heritage and legacy. Understanding who built this area reveals the island's rich creative and working class legacy. Every roofline and chimney reflects the hands of real tradespeople whose contributions are often overlooked. Figures like Jacob Jones, Errol Coffin, Eliza Codd, along with many unnamed builders, deserve recognition. People of color played a vital role in shaping Nantucket's trades as well, and more research is needed to tell their stories. Pictured here is the timber frame at Four Race Court, which was built using traditional methods by today's craftsmen. This work continues a legacy of strong, thoughtful design rooted in local history. So now we ask you guys as a call to action to engage with, hopefully in the future, some archives, some walking tours, oral histories, and support historical exhibits or a museum dedicated to Nantucket's building history. As construction and real estate drive the modern economy, understanding the past is key to shaping this island's future as the only historically landmark island in the nation.
Do we have any questions for this first group? Yeah. I see this guy first.
Well, first of all, great presentation. It's really interesting to see all your collective research. We know that most of the buildings on Nantucket were built without architects, and I know that a major influence in the 19th century to how buildings were designed were pattern books by Andrew Jackson Davis. I think a significant one was Asher Benjamin's American Builder's Companion, which basically gave you all the details you would ever need to know for the Greek revival. Have you found direct connections from those resources to the houses you studied here on the island?
Great question. I can take a stab at this first, and then you guys can chime in. So that is a great question, and I think they were building so quickly too. I can't imagine there wasn't a tie to some of the pattern books, but that is something we should be looking into. I agree. There's an archive of pattern books. I think it would be cool to go through and start lining them up. But do you guys want to add anything to that? There is a request, though, that you add the names of the pattern books, please, to the wall. Because, yeah, that's a great one. Yeah. Oh, Fran,
Hi. I have something to add to the bottom of the hill topography. Another name that was applied to Five Corners was Pompey's Corner, because the large house that's sometimes been misidentified as Absalom Boston's house was actually built by a white man, and his heirs sold it to Stephen Pompey, and then it was occupied by his son Samson Pompey. So that spot gave the name to Five Corners as Pompey's Corner. But there's also a reference to Pompey's Valley, and it's not really clear from the reference, but I have assumed that it is in fact exactly that dip between Silver and Dover Street, which of course is unbuildable. And I'd also like to just offer a little caution. Be careful not to identify Azorians as people of color, because they're not.
great. Thanks, Fran. All right. We probably have time for one or two more, so thanks.
Hi. Thank you for helping us out. I'm Lee Saperstein, 20 New Street. And my deed, and I respond to Cleary, said Newtown on West Monomoy. It had both names. My house was erected in 1760 because the owner had purchased a dwelling from Jonathan Small, an Indian of Quays. So when people ask me, how old is your house? I say, I don't know. I do know it went on New Street in 1760. Clay Lancaster, whom we have met, referred to it as much altered. And so it doesn't fit. So my last comment is on the doorways. Have you noticed how many Nantucket houses have a very dominant doorway with a blind transom, because the doorway actually rises up into the second story. We have a few with glass, means that the interior was taller than most. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. Any other questions for this group? Oh yeah, Hallie.
First of all, I wanted to thank all the hard work you've done. Just makes me so happy to see this. For the group that worked on the different carpenters and builders, John B. Nicholson is one of my favorites. I actually, when I was a Penn student, researched off of Cottage Court. It's where my great-great-grandparents lived. Those houses, I believe, were speculative, but they were John B. Nicholson. I didn't note it on the map that was shown. But it's amazing to see, and Clay Lancaster did a great job of documenting those builders, like John B. Nicholson and Charles Robinson. So this effort, obviously, we want to add on to that. So great job. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I hope you all have liked our presentation so far. My name is Bryce Bowen, and I'm currently getting my bachelor's in architecture at the University of Florida.
We've already met. So we're going to talk about the businesses that we identified in West Monomoy throughout history. So starting off with our earliest business, It's the old mill. So this mill was tentatively constructed in 1746, though something really interesting that the NHA makes a little caveat of is that it could be much older. So 1746 is the most recent old date that we have. And it was originally one of 4 mills. So that ridge along the upper part of our study area would have had 4 working mills in this time period. And so the mills are exclusively grist milling. That's still what they are today, which means milling corn. So that could have been used for cornmeal. And the mills really represent a transition from an agricultural to more of an industrialized livelihood, which we're looking at in our study area. And the mills were, well, the one remaining mill was bought by the NHA in 1896. But before we get there, we're going to back up a little bit. So this is an 1850 farm map of all the farms in Nantucket, and our study area is in that red circle. And we have a lot of questions about this. We're curious about if the corn that was milled was ever grown in our study area. We really don't know, so that's a question for further research. And we're also curious because we have noticed that in some deeds, our study area really early on, before it was developed much, was referred to as sheep commons. And we didn't get to look into that much, but we're really curious about what type of agriculture or pastoral use was happening in our study area. And based on the deeds, it seems like sheep commons is mostly referred to for kind of the southern and eastern adjacent areas. So the mill has been owned by a variety of Nantucketers, but we're going to look at 1854, and that is when it sold to the first Azorean miller, who was named George Enos, and he's a former mariner who changed his livelihood to milling. And another question for further research is he was a New Guinea resident. It says so with the NHA, but we have not found him yet in our deeds, so we're still looking for him. And so after George Enos, the mill passes through several more Azorean millers until 1866 when it sells to Francis Sylvia, or John Francis Sylvia, who is another Azorean mariner turned miller. And he's also a New Guinea resident. He lived at what is currently 7 Spring Street, and at the time would have been 5 Fish Lane. And he's a really interesting character for us to look at. So he, while he's the mill owner, the mill is still fully operational. It's milling grist. But he also changes it a little bit and begins to embrace this emerging tourism economy. So he sets up a gift shop at the mill, and he's selling gifts and trinkets like that spoon you can see in the top image. And as tourism is starting, he's starting to invite people up to the mill, and he's making it really a scenic or a landscape destination. As you can see, the bottom 2 images are portraits and paintings of him, and he was a bit of a character. He had his painting done beside the mill, looking out into the distance, kind of this romantic figure on the hill. And he owns the mill for 30 years. He owns it for a really long time, until 1896 when he dies. And that's when the NHA purchases the mill. And it's believed to be the longest continuously operating mill in United States history, which is really interesting. And in addition to buying the mill, the NHA purchases an acre of land around the mill, which really formally creates the area of Mill Hill.
Okay, so talking about the local neighborhood businesses. It was common for this area for residential and commercial uses to be blended, creating a lively, interconnected, multicultural atmosphere. Within this map shown here, there are known 12 businesses that are identified that worked in their home base and supplied the community. Upon further research, we have 9, which are in blue on the map, that we do not know exactly where they worked, but we know that they lived within the community. And then furthermore, we have 3 on the map, which are labeled in green, that we know worked within town. And just highlighting a few of these, we have in the late 19th century, early 20th century, Azorean immigrant-owned grocery stores that played a key role. These were not specifically identified on the first map because we did not have the exact locations, but a few of them that we do have is John Minetka's on York and Orange, Anton Sylvia's 1 block up from that, and John Murray's off Silver Street. These stores are essential gathering places for the Azorean community. A few of the other ones listed on this page are the Whitening Milk Company, the Orange Street Grocery, and Ames Bakery. Furthermore, currently, we only have 3 neighborhood businesses. These are small local shops that are the last traces of a once thriving neighborhood. The large picture on the left is Joe's Barber Shop. Joe Souza opened this up in 56 Pleasant Street, where he originally started working for his uncle at the Eagle Barber Shop. This barber shop really highlights the tradition of family-run businesses. The top right image is the weaving room that is on, I did not label that, I'm sorry, founded in 1984 by Anna Lynn. Lastly, the bottom right, as we all know, is Flock, Nantucket's only knit shop. It was moved to 79 Orange Street in 2015 and preserved the building's historic facade and commercial use.
So we've seen that there's a legacy of businesses in our study area from all the way back to the mill through a different type of business through the 20th century. But there is a really big shift in 1972, which is when Nantucket adopts their first zoning bylaw, which is quite a bit later than the rest of the United States, which is really interesting. So most of our study area is in the purple, which is zoned historic, and then in that little piece of yellow, which is zoned residential 1. And something that's really important about knowing this is that this zoning does not permit most commercial and business uses, which includes grocery stores, pharmacies, bakeries, convenience stores, medical clinics. Can't happen in our study area. However, despite zoning, there is still a lot of commercial activity happening in our neighborhood today via short-term rentals like Airbnb or Vrbo. So in that bottom image, that's just like a 2 or 3 block little zoom in of our study area, and there are 15 short-term rentals in it. And short-term rentals are really interesting. They're really highly contested here as they are in much of the rest of the United States. It's really interesting because in our study area, there is this legacy of boarding houses and renting rooms that does set a precedent for this type of business use. It's been happening here very far back into our deed research, and it's still happening today. And it's also a significant departure in some ways from the other models of businesses that we've looked at, such as having a grocery store every block. So it's a really interesting transitional time and a different type of business that we were noticing. So we were looking at businesses because they're really important, and they're important for a lot of reasons, but 3 of the ones we pulled out is that neighborhood businesses create a really strong social infrastructure. They allow for those quick, casual run-ins with your neighbors that create strong relationships. They support the local economy. They keep your money with your neighbors. They keep it on the island. And then they also encourage local entrepreneurship, which creates a really vibrant community and also creates pathways for people to stay here and create their livelihoods and their lives.
So what's next? As you've seen, the neighborhood's commercial landscape has changed dramatically over time, with only a few local businesses remaining in historically zoned areas. This sharp decline raises concern of losing the unique character and community feel of the neighborhood. The true community hub that once existed has faded. It's important to ask, how can we support these businesses and bring back a mix that truly serves and reflects the people who live here? These questions that we have asked ourselves is, should we be doing more to support these remaining businesses and help them thrive? What kinds of businesses would y'all like to see in y'all's neighborhood? And are there any local shops or services that have already been here that you think are important to share? We'd love to hear y'all's thoughts and stories. Thank y'all.
Hello, I'm Jill. I'm an undergrad interior design student from the University of Florida.
Hi, my name is Annette Black. I work for the National Park Service doing environmental science and historic preservation.
And today we're presenting about institutions. So the institutions of Nantucket tell a story of an ever-changing neighborhood, seeing the island through its tumultuous whaling period, grappling with its remains and the diversity of people that come with it. We ask, where were they? Who did they serve? Where did they go? Why were they there? And how does this reflect the changing demographics throughout Nantucket's history, especially on the south side of town? Starting with the schools, there are 5 within the area, clustered in the southernmost extremity as well near 5 corners, which include the Benjamin Coffin Schoolhouse, the African School, the York Street School, the Bear Street School, and the Mission School, 2 of which still stand today. The before public education came to Nantucket in 1827, private schools were available to those who could afford tuition, like the Benjamin Coffin Schoolhouse that stood near his home, 5 Cherry, on the southwest side of Pleasant Street. But not everyone could afford these schools, and there were still 300 children that had no access to any form of education until 1827, when the town finally decided to allocate funds towards public education. The colored community on the island, however, took initiative on their children's education and began a Sabbath school in 1825, which was then absorbed into the public education system and given them town funding in 1827. In 1840, the question of integrating the Nantucket schools came when Eunice Ross, under tutelage of her teacher at the African School, Anna Gardner, applied to the first high school and was denied admission. In retaliation, the trustees of the meeting house rescinded the school from the public school system, and the town then built the York Street School, a few doors down. In a paper in 1854, it is said the town voted to move the building to Matticat, possibly as the Matticat School. In 1843, the schools were briefly integrated before the decision was overturned by an anti-abolitionist school committee, and colored students were all asked to move to the York Street School, leading to a 2-year-long boycott with reintegration of schools in 1846. The non-white population of the island reached a 19th century peak of 576 in 1830. By 1850, after the Great Fire, it lowered to 342. Joseph Farnham says, "These respected colored people of the past, segregated in my native town so many years ago, have passed on. As they left, the use of the African Meeting House as a school went with them." Another school that stood in the study area is the Bear Street School, later renamed the Spring Hill School, which once stood behind what is now known as 3 Bear Street. It was listed as a primary school, and so all the teachers were women, possibly including Anna Gardner, as male teachers were seen as more suited to teaching higher levels of education, such as high school. In 1835, the town bought the land, and it functioned as a school for just over 2 decades, when they sold the school in 1857. It was later moved to a site on Wales Street for one Charles C. Crosby, and later demolished. You can see how the timeline of the schools coincides with the tail end of the Golden Whaling period, and subsequently fizzles out with it, as people leave the island for better economic opportunity. This is supported by the fact that a lot of the teachers who are recorded as having taught at the Bear Street School are only found in the 1840 and 1850 census as living in Nantucket. When describing the school in 1858, it is said that the Spring Hill School was a mixed one, having 3 grades of scholars in it who are deprived of the gradation system which prevails in all other schools in town. These scholars came from the south side of town, and shown are the southern district lines described by the town in 1843. From the east side of Main Street, you come down to Pine Street, down to High Street, and then all the way to the end of Pleasant. Other schools that existed were charity schools, which appeared in times of economic strife on the island. In 1859 came the Mission School, which was started by women and affiliated women's societies, such as Anne Morslander Chase. The school was supported entirely by benevolent donations and quietly aiming to elevate the character of our more needy children. Located right above the former Bear Street School on 117 Orange, it is possible it was a response to the closing of the Bear Street School in 1857 to offer support to those needy children in the most southern part of the study area. Later in the 20th century, it saw the consolidation of schools, which you can see when comparing public school examinations from 1836, which listed 7 unique schools, to just 3 in 1903. These later schools included the Orange Street School, now demolished, and the Cypress Pierce School, named after one of the men who pushed to integrate the Nantucket schools nearly a century prior, and which was built on the corner of Sparkton and Atlantic Avenue to replace the Orange Street School in the 1930s as a neighborhood public school. While integrated, students were still separated due to the school zoning, in which students that lived above Main Street were to be sent to Academy Hill, while those below, the Newtowners, would attend the Orange Street School. However, when describing his youth on the island in the early 1900s, John Mendonça, an Azorean youth, emphatically stated that due to the intermingling of diverse people, there was no color consciousness on this island, in which he recognized when he left the island for the mainland. This diversity is still seen today, and while it's changed from the African American population in the late 19th century, Spanish and Portuguese still appear on the public school websites, reflecting new waves of immigration patterns in the 20th and 21st centuries. While no longer localized for convenience, centralizing the schools to Mid-Island has created a diverse, tight-knit student community as children grow up with the same set of peers as they move up through the Nantucket school system. In terms of next steps, further study can be done to verify and unearth more research into the schools without well-written histories, such as the Mission School, which is still extant, as well as the Bear and York Street schools. On a broader scale, further study into the history of schools on the entire island can be done, especially with the island tradition of moving existing buildings, such as the possible connection between the York and Matticat School.
I'm actually giving this presentation on behalf of Matolo, who's walking the UF stage today, getting her PhD. Churches. The 1700s was the height of the Quaker religious influence here on Nantucket, As the island's wealth and population grew, various Protestant denominations began sending ministers to establish a presence here. In the mid-19th century, Nantucket's golden age, the island was home to at least 11 different churches. And here you can see where we've denoted different meeting houses. The African Meeting House in Nantucket was built in 1823 by members of the New Guinea neighborhood, formed in response to racial segregation in other churches. It was consecrated in 1825 as the African Baptist Church and was led by Reverend James Crawford, who was a former enslaved man. He also lived right around the corner. He became Nantucket's longest serving clergyman. The church serves as a vital space for worship, education, community for the island's Black residents. It closed in 1911 and was later restored in 1999 and became a part of the Museum of African American History. The African Zion Church of Nantucket was formed in 1832 and incorporated in 1835, organized by the Nantucket Women's Anti-Slavery Society in response to segregation in the Northern Congregational Church and local schools. The congregation repurposed a former carpenter's shop on Orange Street as their place of worship to create a vital space for abolitionist activities, education, and mutual aid within Nantucket's Black community. Led by its first pastor, Arthur Cooper, the church remained active until its closure in 1882. Alfonso Hall was built in 1890 by Nantucket's growing Portuguese and Azorean immigrants on Cherry Street and William Street in Nantucket. The building was named after King Alfonso of Portugal. The church is now called Griffin Hall in honor of Father Joseph M. Griffin, the priest of Nantucket's Roman Catholic Church, St. Mary's, during the 20th century. Before becoming a parish hall and community space, the property at 15 Cherry Street was owned by Captain John Murray, a whaling captain from the Azores. He and his wife, Anna, played a key role in organizing the traditional Portuguese procession, which is now hosted by St. Mary's Church. Just as a note, St. Mary's Our Lady of the Isles is located outside the study area on Federal Street and was completed in July 1892. The hall was acquired to extend its reach to the growing Azorean, Portuguese, and Cape Verdean immigrants residing in the New Guinea neighborhood. Churches in Nantucket were more than religious sites. They were communal institutions deeply involved in abolitionist activities, education, and the temperance movement. St. Mary's and Alfonso Hall remain the only Roman Catholic parish on Nantucket. Nantucket remaining churches, historic and contemporary, continue to connect past and present, faith and heritage, reminding us that this is a place shaped by the sea. It was often the churches that moored the soul to the community. You'll be seeing me again. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rena Braxton. I'm a third-year undergrad going to Randolph College in Virginia. You've already met me. Our research presentation is based around women's property ownership and community building today. Women were essential in weaving the fabric on Nantucket society, playing dynamic roles that extended far beyond solidifying family ties through marriage. They lended on one another, forming strong networks of mutual support and community, representing the stable, non-mobile segment of Nantucket's population, with widows and single women making up a significant portion. Here, as you can see on our map, we have been able to locate, so far through our research, 38 properties tied to women ownership. The blue will represent all of the properties, and the specific green ones represent the notable women we'll talk about today.
The Carter family and Windsor Cottage. In 1899, John Carter and Mabel Pugh from Windsor, North Carolina, eloped to Philadelphia. John dabbled as a grocer for a while until he obtained a prize job with the federal government at the U.S. Postal Service, while Mabel worked as a seamstress. In 1925, Mabel visited Nantucket with a friend, and it reminded her of her childhood visits to Nag's Head Beach in the summer. John and Mabel then proceeded to purchase a property on Nantucket as a getaway. Building began in 1926. The summer their daughter Isabel went off to Europe with 3 of her girlfriends and completed in 1972. The home was dubbed Windsor Cottage. The family's home became a focal point for the island's African American community. The Carter's home was the first Black-owned summer residence on Nantucket, offering a place for Black college students and summer visitors that had been turned away from the white-owned and dominated spaces. For $2.50 a night, you could rent a room on the first floor on occasion. 2 of the Carter's daughters, Florence and Isabel, were teachers and entrepreneurs running Florbell Catering Box Lunch, a to-go business which they later moved from their home onto 23 Federal Street. The Carter family helped create a gathering point for the Black community, as well as businesses on the island of Nantucket.
The next story I have is Nabby Bailey, thanks to the other islanders and further research in that. Mrs. Bailey was a white woman born to Reuben and Mary Folger in 1778, being the youngest out of all of her siblings, marrying Mr. John Gorell in 1794, having 3 children, and then remarrying in 1811 to Benjamin Bailey, having an additional 3. On the 13th of October in 1830, at the age of 52, Nabby is seen on the deeds for buying property in our study area at 6 Atlantic Avenue, and again on the 12th of April in 1855 at 4 Atlantic Avenue. Looking through newspapers and the research in the other islanders, it is known that Nabby owned a house near the waterfront labeled as ill-governed and disorderly for providing service to biracial individuals and selling liquor without a license. We are almost certain that her disorderly house was her official living house by the waterfront. Although she did not live in our study area, she owned land there. And I think her story is what is important due to her providing a place of solitude and having an outlet for individuals of color, especially biracial individuals, when they were so welcome in other spaces. I would also like to point out her daughter, Eliza Bailey, a teacher at the African American School for 2 years before she sadly passed away to illness. An example of biracial individuals here in our study area is the Snow family, connected to 1 and 6 Atlantic Avenue. Here on the top, we have Lucreta Tweedy, and on the bottom, it's debated whether that is Cornelia or Ella Snow, but that is one of the Snow daughters. Lucreta Tweedy and Thomas Snow had 3 children, Cornelia, Ella, and James. Thomas Snow was a known property owner in our study area and possible properties outside of the study area. After his passing, he left his properties to his 2 daughters in the 1800s, where they were able to sell and get revenue from them. I believe biracial women owning and selling property in the 1800s was one of my favorite findings this summer in the program. Next, we have the infamous Miss Florence Higginbotham. Florence Higginbotham was a Virginia-born African-American woman, like me, who came to Nantucket seeking to start her life. She was able to secure a job here managing Underhill Cottages and living with her employer. Later, she purchased the historic Seneca Boston house, using it for rental income and eventually living in it after the crash of the stock market in 1929. In 1933, she purchased the African Meeting House for rental income, where it was used for storage and even a studio.
This is Susan Veter. Susan Veter is an amazing woman. So her and her husband, he was a captain. She owned a property. She did not live on this particular property in our study area, but her and her husband go on a ship, they go away, travel the world, come back, he leaves, she thinks he left her. So she sells all her property to her brother so that he can't get it. Then she finds out he's dead and she gets all the property back. But she is awesome. She was a landlord and she had many properties and she really did help shape, and she sold to a lot of women that were single or unmarried or widowed. And she's a really interesting lady, and you can read more about her in 1,000 Leagues of Blue by Betsy Tyler.
I believe Florence Higginbotham and Susan Veter are the perfect examples of women entrepreneurialism within our study area through property ownership.
Who are women who have quietly served their communities? Whose names are missing from the deeds and the stories? The unique circumstances of the island that required women to hold more power than was usually socially acceptable, as well as the economic opportunities afforded to people of color at the time, created an environment where women of all colors flourished. They were entrepreneurs like the Carter sisters. They were landlords like Susan Veeder and Florence Higginbotham. These women helped shape the Nantucket that we know today.
Two quick comments. With respect to renting of houses, it may be a myth, but Nantucketers built back houses, and there are 4 of them on New Street, one on my property. And the myth is that the owner of the main house in the 50s, 60s would move to the back house and rent for the summer the front house. And there may be many more than 4. And then for my own property, I may have it backwards, but Hilda Allen owned the property and then deeded it to her daughter, Dorothy Allen. It could be the other way around. And that's been memorialized by Allen's Way in Nantucket and Don Allen Ford.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, I think that this is a really interesting grouping too, the institutions and the businesses, because they tell a lot about the neighborhood. And at the end of all the presentations, we're going to have a longer, richer discussion around neighborhood change and stuff. So I actually would like to come back to a lot of these questions at the end. But I think let's give this group a round of applause, and we will move on to our next group. So for our next group, we're going to start looking at the shifting cultures within this community. And we're actually going to be working from some of the more recent cultures that we see here, backward in time. Take it away.
All right, so this presentation is a one-woman show. I hope you don't get sick of me, but hello, my name is Amanda Ganciran. I'm currently finishing up my bachelor's degree in architecture at the University of Florida, but more importantly, I'm a very, very proud daughter of Cuban immigrants born and raised in Miami. So beginning this research in June, it was as soon as we discovered the immigrant community in our study area that I knew exactly what I would be talking about today. So please allow me the opportunity to share with you a quick crash course into Azorean immigration on Nantucket. So no better place to start than geography, right? Portuguese exploration in the 15th century led to the discovery and eventual colonization of many islands off of Africa's coast, as they served as really, really great navigational checkpoints. The Portuguese Liberal Wars also occurred from 1828 to 1834, and it coincided with the whaling period and ships beginning to frequent the Azores, providing promise of new opportunities for many Azoreans abroad. The colonization of the Azores and other island archipelagos like Cape Verde were crucial to whaling journeys, though. These accessible islands gave ships an opportunity to stop somewhere in the middle of their journeys to stock up not only on new supplies, but also on new crew members. Azorean and Cape Verdean immigrants represent some of the largest non-English speaking populations on Nantucket in the 19th and 20th century because of this. As noted in the other islanders, the transition that Azoreans made from their home countries to Nantucket is often dependent on family connections. Here we can kind of start to see what Azorean ownership of the homes in our study area looked like from the 1850s to the 1880s. And though it was likely not a complete representation, much more research needs to be done. Each pin here represents a family that was born in the Azores and then established a homestead here, making them first generation. With the promise of success in whaling too to draw them in, Azorean and Cape Verdean families often began their journey to Nantucket with just one member of the family leaving the home first. This was normally the head of house, which was the father figure or husband of the home, where he left to establish a homestead, and the rest of their family would join in coming years. Now, from the 1890s to the 1910s, we can see the decline of whaling and an affordable cost of living coming into the increase. An affordable cost of living, creating an increase of families coming to join the established household. I know, low cost of living on Nantucket. Additionally, we have the conflict of World War I, which greatly affected day-to-day life in the Azores, a heavy reliance of many nations on Azorean islands as those navigational checkpoints made the region very, very vital to Portuguese allies. But the fear of German invasion likely influenced a great migration for more Azoreans elsewhere. In this time, we can also see a growth of second-generation Azoreans, where each of these red markers here show home ownership being held by the children of Azorean-born parents, allowing the properties to remain in the same family. And then this final blue marker here would depict a single third-generation family in our study area at this time. This is the Marcelino family who maintained ownership of this home from 1893 to 1949. So now from the 1920s to the 1950s, we can see a continued influx of Azoreans immigrating to Nantucket due to economic opportunity on the island from increased tourism, as well as a draw for new immigrants to join an already established Azorean community on island. Again, we see more global conflict. They have the start of World War II in 1939, and the importance of Azores in naval and air bases supported more families to emigrate. For second-generation families in this time, we see more focus on new ownership rather than homes being passed down. And then finally, we still have our third-generation Marcelino family holding on to ownership of 55 Union. For our final time period, the 60s to the 70s, we see a very major shift in immigration patterns, increased cost of living, sounds more familiar, and new development. The study area became much more desirable for new residents, potentially influencing the changing demographics of the neighborhood. We also, very similar to the last second generation map, many of the families that owned these homes show patterns of buying into the neighborhood rather than maintaining their past familial ownership. And in our final third generation display, we can see that very few Azoreans from years past actually held on to their homes and continued owning the properties that their parents and grandparents had purchased. In 1975, we also see the Carnation Revolution in the Azores, which overthrew the Portuguese dictatorship, and in the following year, 1976, granted autonomy to the Azores. With these actions on Nantucket and abroad coinciding with the decrease in Azorean population in the neighborhood, the question must be asked, where did the Azorean population go? So, while whaling allowed an exchange of ideas, trade, and artifacts, it was the actual immigration of these people to the island that truly solidified Nantucket as being more deeply connected to the rest of the world. The role of Azorean communities was crucial in expanding the language of this island, as well as in sharing a holistic understanding of a faraway place and a country while forming a new community abroad. In recent years, what can we do now? In recent years, we've seen a great deal of action from the NHA to preserve Cape Verdean culture through different various museum exhibits, short films, online researches, things of that nature. And while Cape Verdean and Portuguese colonies and other Portuguese colonies like the Azores share many similarities, they're often lumped together in a way that closes off any conversation regarding nuance and prevents a true understanding of how different these cultures really are. Because initiative to understand Azorean culture has not been completed to the extent in which it has been done for that of Cape Verde, strides can definitely be made in filling this gap. By creating focused research on the historic and potentially current Azorean community, we can start asking, though, how has the movement of this diverse community affected the culture of not only our research area, but of Nantucket as a whole? How much of Nantucket is still Azorean, and how many of these individuals still feel a connection to their heritage? This additional information would aid greatly in distinguishing these two Portuguese colony communities from one another, giving individuals more opportunities to find overlaps or see where they differ. Furthering census and deed research, of course, in this area would also aid greatly in understanding the full history of this area and the people who made it what it is. Thank you all so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Haley Weltzine. I'm a current master's student studying historic preservation at the University of Florida. And today I'll be talking about a topic some of you may know a little bit about already, the whaling industry in Nantucket, but more specifically, the area of West Monomoy. So these were men or individuals who helped shape Nantucket's maritime economy and cultural identity into what we know it is today. And while some of these names are already well known to some, many others are still underrepresented. And today I would like to introduce you to just a few of their stories. So over the course of these last 9 weeks that we've been here, and through our property and deed research, we've identified 52 mariners in our study area, and we've also been able to connect them to around 30 documented voyages. So these are ranging from short Atlantic trips to multi-year expeditions in the Pacific and Arctic whaling grounds. These individuals were of very ethnic and racial identities, including Caucasian, African American, Azorean, Cape Verdean, Wampanoag, and Native American descent, to name a few. But I also want to note that when we do refer to these ethnic or racial identities in these terms that we're using today, that you can see in this pie chart, we are using language found in these historical documents like census rolls, deeds, ship logs, etc. And these are not labels that we are assigning, but classifications imposed by the record keepers of their time. So first of all, I would like to move on to some of the familiar faces that you may already know, that we have already found in our study area, like that of Captain Absalom Boston, who we've connected to 20 York Street. He was the first Black whaling captain to command an all-Black crew aboard the Industry in 1822. A second notable figure is that of Edward J. Pompey, a Black man, mariner, abolitionist, store owner, and civic leader who hosted Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison during their trips to Nantucket. And then last of all, we have Stephen Bailey and Owen Chase over there on the right. Stephen Bailey was a captain of around 5 voyages, well known within the community, and he was also the son of Abigail Nabby Bailey, who you heard a little bit about earlier. And then we have Owen Chase, most famously known as one of the few survivors of the shipwreck of the Essex in 1820. And now for some faces and names that you may not know yet. So our first mariner that we wanted to highlight in these case studies is Hosea Pocknett Jr., born in 1803. We've connected him to the property of 12 Atlantic Avenue. He sailed on the whale ship Essex just like Captain Owen Chase, but he was there one voyage prior to its famous shipwreck, which went on to inspire Moby Dick. Now, during this voyage, Hosea was apprenticed under James Lewis, and during this contract and this voyage, he was instructed to give Lewis half of his pay at the end of it. And another interesting note from this voyage is one more individual found in these crew logs, that of Reuben Pocknett, who may or may not be of relation to Hosea Pocknett Jr., but this would be some future research that we would love to dive into. Hosea would later go to sail upon the Washington in 1819, after which he appears very briefly in the record as from his brief marriage and divorce to Patience Wood Pocknett, another Mashpee Native American woman. And then finally, Hosea last pops up in our records as being buried in the Mashpee Town Cemetery in Barnstable, Massachusetts in 1843. Moving on to another interesting case study here is that of the Beers family, who that lived at 16 Atlantic Avenue from the time of 1816 to 1865. Henry W. Beers Sr. really starts this legacy on the property in 1816 when he purchases this property at 16 Atlantic Avenue with the promise to repair the house on the land. In 1821, Henry Sr. grants the power of attorney to his wife, Flora Beers, likely to go ahead and hold down the property while he was away at sea. Now, in 1834, Henry Jr. is aboard the ship, the Oliver Crocker. He is likely the son of Henry Sr., along with that of Braddock Summons Beers, who first gets the property after his father's passing in 1821, holds it briefly for a year before he turns it over to his little brother, Henry W. Beers Jr. After Henry Jr.'s death, let me back up just a moment. Now, when Henry Beers Jr. was out at sea, he first served as a third mate aboard the Oliver Crocker and later as a second mate and log keeper on the ship the Mohawk. Now, after Henry Jr.'s death, the property goes to pass on to his sister, Paulina B. Elliott, who likely lived there during Henry's voyages and until her own passing. And this just goes on to demonstrate this continuous holding of these properties by mariners within their families and also within the profession themselves. Now, this is a family we would love to dive a little bit more into, but that is beyond the scope of this project as of right now. And then our last little case study we want to highlight is Joseph P. Sylvia, an Azorean immigrant. And he was born in the Azores in 1790. But by the 1830s, Joseph sailed aboard the Rambler and the Rose and owned property at Fort Silver Street. After his time as a mariner, he went on to become a ship chandler, craftsman, and liquor store proprietor. And I want to go ahead and highlight these two photos over on the right, which are pieces of craftsmanship that Joseph P. Sylvia crafted during his time aboard these ships and that are held by the Nantucket Historical Association today. And really just goes to speak to the larger story of or trend of mariners who once ashore took on these new roles as artisans, farmers, business owners, and community figures. And I want to go ahead and read the little inscription on this whale tooth up in the top right-hand corner, which says, "This is the tooth of the last whale killed by Joseph P. Sylvia in the ship Rambler in the year 1821, Captain Benjamin Worth, master." So where did all these voyages take our mariners? So first of all, these 52 mariners of New Guinea were not bound to one port. So early on, you can see here this map from the 1700s to the 1800s where whalers are encountering whales. And I would like to give credit for whalinghistory.org for really pulling this together in terms of visuals. But early on, these whaling routes were largely contained within the Atlantic. But over time, as local stocks were depleted and the demand for sperm oil increased, voyages start pushing into the Pacific and into the Arctic. You can see this here in 1800 to 1830, and then 1830 to 1850 when things really start getting kicked off. So the expansion of these routes really mirrors the evolution of the whaling industry itself, with longer voyages, more diverse crews, and an increase of risk. So our mariners are following these shifts in the industry, going further from home to support this rapid industrializing economy, until its eventual decline in the early 20th century, as shown by this visual here. We really have a taper off. And this is just a little map to show you all of the different ports that we've been able to connect these 52 mariners from. And you can see each little red dot lists how many voyages we have going to each of these areas. And I would like to point out that little dot down in the bottom left-hand corner that says 27 in the Pacific Ocean. So really just continuing to highlight this fact. So basically, as this industry is moving westward, Nantucket's mariners are leading the way to these new whaling grounds, and some, like the Beers family, end up in places like New Zealand, Hawaii, etc. This wasn't just about chasing whales, it was about adapting to a changing global economy and one that pushed these men to journey around the world. So what are they doing when they return back to shore? So despite traveling across the globe, many mariners are returning home to invest back in New Guinea and West Monomoy. So these wages are used to fund their property purchases, schools, churches, and advocacy work. So really giving back to this community. So individuals like Edward J. Pompey that we mentioned earlier hosted abolition meetings, Absalom Boston co-funded a school for Black children, and others really helped found civic institutions that uplifted their community. So these were not just laborers, these were civic builders. And a key pattern that we observed was that multiple mariners often lived at the same property, either over generations or, like I said earlier, are passing these to other mariners. Some of these properties include 16 Atlantic, 12 Atlantic, 3 York Street. And these weren't just houses, these were anchors and intergenerational sites of labor and return. And these experiences are passed from one sailor to the next, house to house, and ship to ship. So as we close, I would like to leave you with this slide of just the images that we have in regards to these 52 mariners that were found. So we have some that do have portraits and faces to these names, but many that do not, and many stories that are still waiting to be uncovered and names that we haven't found yet. So some questions I would like to leave you with. So whose stories are still missing from Nantucket's history of the maritime industry? What does it mean when we have these multiple generations of mariners living at the same address? How do we ethically interpret race, labor, and identity from fragmented or biased records? And how might this research change how we commemorate maritime history in Nantucket? I really invite you guys to visit this story map. There's a lot more stories than this came from. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, especially through our last presentation and our tallest. I'm Mariah McSherry McGrath. I'm on the faculty in the School of Urban Studies and Planning at Portland State University in Oregon.
And hi, my name is Nicholas Regan. I'm a graduate student at Southern Connecticut State University. Within our final presentation today, we'll be sharing our findings on African American life within our study area.
Before we dive into the findings, we want to start with a quote from Isabel Carter Johnston Stewart. She's a Black Nantucketer who's the 5th generation of her family to own the Carter family home in New Guinea. Her words help explain why it matters to search for New Guinea and why we're choosing to use that place name today. She wrote, "My family's small piece of property was on the edge of what in days long past had been the Black Quarter, known as New Guinea, a fact never mentioned during my growing up years. Not until I wandered into the firehouse one day back in the late 1950s and spied the designation colored cemetery on the town map hanging on the wall did I realize distinctions that should have been apparent to me all along. Our part of town was indeed populated by Cape Verdeans and a very few African American families." So today we'd like to talk to you about the journey of finding New Guinea for ourselves. The 3 main things that we hope to communicate to you are that there's been a long and uninterrupted African American presence in the neighborhood, and that the idea of New Guinea still has resonance today. That the historical record shows a variety of sophisticated strategies for building wealth and political power in this community, and that Nantucket today has many opportunities for preserving and expanding the legacy of the New Guinea community. Before we continue, we just want to mention our usage of the term African American in the context of discussing New Guinea. This was a community shaped by migration, intermarriage, and the global whaling industry. And scholars such as Francis Cartoonan and Nidra Lee, both of whom have joined us today, have written about the ways that overlapping identities have affected racial categorization on the island, both in terms of how people saw themselves and how they were categorized by others. So for example, people that today might be considered Indigenous or Pacific Islander were deemed Black when they lived in New Guinea in the 19th century. So in our work today, we're focused on people who are descendants of the survivors of the Middle Passage, and we're using the terms African American and Black interchangeably.
There's been a lot of meaningful work that's been done on African American history on Nantucket, and we aimed on building upon this work by linking people to places, identifying buildings that still stand today, and providing a picture of community dynamics. Our study area included much of York Street, where the African Meeting House and the Boston Higginbotham House, pictured here, still stand today. These 2 historic properties have landmark status and are managed by the Museum of African American History. These sites are part of Nantucket's Black Heritage Trail, which is shown here on the right. They are also the location of the most recent Juneteenth celebrations. Another important landmark on that trail is just outside our study area, the historic colored cemetery by Mill Hill behind the hospital. Original research done by Barbara Ann White and the Nantucket Public School students uncovered the history of the cemetery. They created a data set that we use to understand who in our neighborhood might be a person of color. The Other Islanders by dedicated local historian Francis Rowley Cartoonan further aided our research. This book showcases the stories of a variety of cultural groups on the island, including Black and African Nantucketers. Another list of islanders of color came from Black on Gray, a 1983 undergraduate history thesis from Princeton University. In this work, Anna Isabella Kaldenbach Montemayor documented the island's African American population and established that the whaling industry, rather than the island's political climate, is what initially drew Black residents to Nantucket. Today, islanders frequently travel through the intersection where Atlantic Avenue meets York and Pleasant Ave. This is a key nexus from the onset of New Guinea's development. Our colleague Linda showed you earlier how Black residents seem to be clustered around that intersection on the 1858 map by Walling. The Meeting House and Boston Higginbotham House are near this intersection, as were other important community resources, such as the AME Zion Church, which has been lost to time. At various times, the surrounding area has been called Five Corners or Pompey's Corner. On this 1833 map, we've added a red star at the intersection, and you may be able to read that Atlantic Avenue is marked as New Guinea.
One of our most important findings was that there have been Black people owning land and living in the New Guinea area since the early 19th century. In reviewing hundreds of property deeds from the study area, we found many of Nantucket's well-known Black families' names in the deeds. For example, Boston, Pompey, Port, Ross, Dyer, and Coyne. So while we haven't yet been able to look at all of the real estate transactions for the neighborhood, in the ones that we did review, and I think it was more like 500 hours in the deed room because we have to multiply that there were 4 of us in there at a time, we found mentions of the name New Guinea in deeds going all the way back to 1821. And that's for land that today is 8 Atlantic Avenue. The Dyer family was in the first wave of Black residents recorded in the New Guinea neighborhood deeds. From 1805 to 1810, Patience and Samson Dyer had a home on the parcel of land that's 5 Boyers Alley today. Samson was at sea as a harpooner and a whaling captain during the time when they owned the home, and Patience remained on the island. Samson and Patience were both born in Rhode Island, both free people of color, and Samson had African and Wampanoag heritage. Their households recorded in the 1810 census. However, no detail was recorded other than the fact that 9 non-white, non-Indian people lived in the home. We know that the Dyers had 5 children, but we don't know who those other household members might have been. A stone's throw away from the Dyers was John Pompey, who bought land at 26 York in 1819. Samson and Patience Dyer's daughter, Trelonia, married into that family. Then James Ross was also nearby, owning land around York Street and West York Lane. So these families were establishing the roots of a community in New Guinea. Black families continued to live in New Guinea after the precipitous decline of the whaling industry. For example, William Port was born in Calcutta and arrived on Nantucket as a seaman. And he was classified as Black in the 1850 census. And he married the former Christina Pompey after she was widowed. So this is her standing in front of the house on Atlantic Avenue. And that family lived in the New Guinea neighborhood through the early 20th century. And many of the family members were interred in the colored cemetery. You heard before the story of the Carter family and Windsor Cottage and the dynamic environment that they created in the home. This is a picture of John D. and Mabel Pugh Carter. So she came for that first summer in 1925 as a summer seamstress, and they represent the group of African Americans that arrived in the neighborhood in the 20th century.
The Niger family story shows how African Americans pursued economic opportunity across generations by strategically choosing specific careers. The commemorative bricks on this slide honor Theophilus Niger. In 1760, he was manumitted, or freed from slavery, in Guilford, Connecticut. Guilford is my hometown, and my co-presenter Mariah also has family from there. Theophilus married Penelope Tantapin, who was indigenous, and the next generation of Nigers settled in Providence, Rhode Island. One of Theophilus and Penelope's great-grandchildren, Alexander, would end up moving to Nantucket after serving as the first Black member of Providence's typographical union. This profession conferred status and financial stability. Alexander and his wife, Theodosia, returned to Providence before their death, but their home on York Street was passed down to other people of color. This fostered a continuity of real estate holdings across generations of people of color. Absalom Boston is well known for his eminent maritime career and his fight to integrate Nantucket's schools. However, he also had wide real estate holdings. In addition to owning property, Boston had sufficient resources to issue mortgages, another way to earn money through real estate investing. Our research found that Boston owned property on the south side of York Street, not just the well-known Boston Higginbotham house on the north side of the street. We are still working to find the exact location of his holdings and the age of the buildings on the premises. Taking in boarders was another important way for New Guinea residents to supplement their incomes. James Ross, who first appeared in the Nantucket census in 1810 and is listed again in the 1850 census as being born in Africa, which suggests that he may have escaped slavery after being brought to the Americas. Ross was enumerated as a laborer, but he also bought and sold an extensive amount of land, as my colleague mentioned. Two of his children ran boarding houses. James Ross's son, James Ross Jr., and his wife Sarah bought land and opened a boarding house for sailors on Silver Street. Another one of James's senior's children, Maria, married William Whippy, and together they ran the Kanaka boarding house. Another common practice was incorporating boarders into a household as an income generation strategy. Here we see Florence Elizabeth Clay Higginbotham, who had a variety of boarders in her home. Archaeological excavation produced these ceramic artifacts, which have been used as evidence that boarding was a widespread practice amongst Black women in New Guinea. The Carter's family story speaks to how Black women built both wealth and community in New Guinea homes. While you have already heard the story of Windsor Cottage as a place to stay and socialize, John and Mabel Carter's children also started new businesses out of the home. Florence and Isabel opened Floribel Carter's box lunch, preparing meals, a sandwich, cookie, and coleslaw, and selling to locals and tourists there on Prospect Street. They were so successful that they ended up trading for a brick and mortar location at 23 Federal Street.
So this slide lists markers at the colored cemetery that have been identified by Barbara Ann White and others. We highlighted the names from the families that have been mentioned in our presentation today. So with just the few stories that we shared, we've already touched upon the lives of many of the ancestors that are interred there in the cemetery. This speaks to the most clear conclusion from our project, that New Guinea as a place and as an idea is important to Nantucket. More work can and should be done to connect this list of Nantucketers to physical places on the island. As we've seen today, there's a wealth of historical resources in the neighborhood that we studied. Mainly on the east side of the study area, a variety of buildings have been preserved and restored, despite all the changes that have happened in the neighborhood since 1821, when there was that first deed that said New Guinea. So an example is 55 Union Street, which has a beautiful restoration of an 1834 home by John B. Nicholson, who you heard about earlier. But in our project, we've been looking for New Guinea, whose history we know about from scholars and from lore passed down through generations. Our research this summer confirmed and expanded that knowledge, but we're missing a lot of the physical remnants of life in New Guinea, especially in the west side of the study area, where we found more owners who were people of color. Before the John B. Nicholson home was there, Essex Boston lived at 55 Union Street. He was an African-American man who was related to Seneca Boston, who built 27 York Street, also known as the Boston Higginbotham House. He likely lived in an older home on this property on 55 Union prior to the current building's construction. But we don't know what happened to the Boston family's home. Perhaps it was torn down or moved elsewhere. So this artwork shown on the right side of the screen is a portrait of Essex Boston's family, created by Michelle Elzay, who participated in restoring 55 Union. By seeing some of the few physical artifacts that have been linked to the family, we're better able to imagine what New Guinea might have been like. A critical task in documenting this neighborhood will be exploring the vacant and unoccupied buildings on old maps of the neighborhood and cross-referencing them with census data so that we can understand not just what remains, but what has been lost. New Guinea still matters, and our findings show how much potential Nantucket has to build upon that legacy. Thank you.
I have two concluding thoughts, and then we'll open it up for questions. The first is that As we've mentioned, we're really building on a lot of existing research out there. And thank you to Barbara and Fran for coming and assisting us with this research. Thank you to our friends at UMass Boston Archaeology, Dr. Nidra Lee and her student Laura Paisley, who just defended her thesis looking at the location of residences of African Americans outside of this area on Nantucket. I think the phrase that we have heard most today is there is more work to be done. There's a lot more work to be done. The last thing that I want to say, I get a little choked up. These students chose these topics to present on. I'm so sorry. It is a really deeply meaningful and diverse area of study. And the fact that we have students choosing what they want to study and present on just reflects that even more. And it reflects that everyone can find a story to connect with in this area. And that to me is really significant for Nantucket. With that, I want to say we're gonna break with our final food for thought. And then I'd like to also note that we'll end with a QR code where you can get to our website, look at our story maps. We will have this recording on YouTube, both at NCTV and on our YouTube site. And there is more work to be done. Thank you.
So if I could get the rest of the students to come on up. We've put up some really big questions, and I don't expect us to talk about all of these. But we've covered a wide variety of topics today. Everything from short-term rentals to the loss of churches and cultural identity. And so these are really meaty topics. I want to stress that this is not the end of this conversation. This is really the beginning of the conversation. So if there's anyone in the room who we haven't spoken to or who we don't know, if you could either go to our website and get in contact with us that way or leave your contact information with us, we would love to talk with you all more because these are your stories and your histories, and we're just helping you pull them all together in one place. But I'd like to open it up to the floor. Any questions, comments?
Hi, this is a more specific question about the Azorean immigration. So I live in Europe, although I'm connected to Nantucket through my father. I was very lucky. I've been in Lisbon and learned about the destruction of the Portuguese Navy and then growing empire due to a tsunami from either the Azores or the Cape Verde subduction seaquake. Just curious if you guys have done any research or considered any of the options, or what was the economic climate in the Azores and the Cape Verde due to the destruction of the Portuguese Empire, and if that led to any of the immigration from those people?
That's a great question. And more recent history too. Do you want to?
I wish I could give you as good of an answer as you deserve, but we looked more into kind of what was going on historically in a more general sense in Nantucket, of course, and then within the Azores, just seeing the things that were coming up as most prevalent to cause people to leave was World War I and World War II, as well as the Portuguese Liberal Wars. But beyond that, I would assume that those wars were also having economic impacts when these islands were mainly being used as military bases in some capacity. There's only so much room for local businesses to thrive. But that's also me pulling from my parents' experience in Cuba and how that worked for them. So, but yeah, I would love to keep looking into that and get back to you soon.
I was gonna say, that's a really good question because it's really pulling more recent history too. So good stuff to look into. Anyone else? Yeah.
This is a more practical question, and I'm not sure directly how to connect it, but I've spent a lot of time walking around in that neighborhood and also closer to town. is that we have many tourists, many people here that know downtown. They go to all the, I'm on the board of the NHA. I see people like at Greater Light, and they're like, we want more. How do we get them down to that community? And then two really practical things. They want food and they want bathrooms. You used to have Rabimbas at Five Corners. They're not going to walk all the way to Stop and Shop. They're not going to go back to town, but I think the town doing a and you're saying this is all residential. That was interesting to see. It's zoned all residential. So how do we practically draw people down into this area and then take them, it looks like the African Meeting House is a central place to start, and then you can spin off, and you can also spin off into Mariah Mitchell. You can there's a ton of things, but that's to me, a really practical question.
That is an excellent question. Yeah.
I think wayfinding is a big part. I know that there are restrictions on the types and the sizes of signs in Nantucket, but I also think you really don't know that our study area is a place. So I think wayfinding is a big part of that, like drawing people out of downtown and letting them know there's like more to see than like Ralph Lauren and the wharfs. I think the public transportation would also be helpful, and I think it'd be great for, maybe changing zoning too, so we can have some of those businesses back. And also for the meeting house and the museum, because it is such a central spot, expanding that, maybe not in a physical sense because it has space, but developing it more into a destination for people to get to and almost like a hub. Like once you're there, then you can get into the rest of the neighborhood. You have information, and this is like the central spot that if you're downtown and you make it to this point, that you're gonna know where you're going and have things to see. So I think those are ways to start.
I feel like another very obvious thing, I immediately think of Sankaty Lighthouse. That's in the middle of nowhere, what feels like compared to how close downtown is. There's no bathrooms and there's no food, but you have guided tours to take you there, drive you to the location, tell you all about the history. And so implementing more things like that throughout our study area would be a great way for people to become educated on it, have someone who knows what they're talking about tell you, and then drive you past the important places.
I think that that's such a great question. And one of the things we've been really pushing the students this summer too is, you're finding all of this history. What good does it do if no one knows it exists? So we've been really trying to push them too to think, how can we engage the public with this? And honestly, I feel like that could be a whole other PIN summer. We just barely touched on the history and the research and the deeds and trying to connect all of these stories that Fran and Barbara have done such a great job with. Oh my gosh, now we have to tell other people, so. Oh, you wanna just, okay.
I want to speak to this because I'm a new resident at 10 York Street, so right in the same block with the church. And the traffic is so awful. And as you know, and there's a lot of construction that will be going on at least for another year. So there is no place to walk. The trucks are parked the whole length of the sidewalk. So the idea, and it is the bus route, as is West Dover. And it is the straightest route to the hospital. And so all of the emergency vehicles come up. It's the through street, horribly to say, because the first block is narrower than my block, but the sidewalk is unusable. There is no place to park. You're sort of taking your life in your hands when you walk in the street, which is the only choice you have. And so to think of commercial operations in those blocks just seems completely unrealistic. I do wish the town would maybe limit the weight of trucks and the width of trucks. And this summer I've repaired the fence 3 times. But certainly the access where you can see it when you're driving, and the public, the bus is free and the bus stops at the corner. So there's a way to get here if you just know how to do it. And there's a lot of foot traffic on the street. My family walks to town to eat. They walk to Mid-Island. So it really, I mean, we're a half a mile from Main Street, so it's not unwalkable. Technically, it's unwalkable because of the traffic and the sidewalk situation.
Thank you for doing this. I was wondering that one of my questions is what do you do this topic again next year? I mean, one of the ones I was looking forward to was businesses that were in that area, but pre-1875, when a lot of the African American population had moved away. And so I was hoping that might be one. I think that connecting to the Town Chamber of Commerce website, because I know that they are trying to make that more, the cultural department trying to make that more accessible. So maybe some of this research could also go on there. That was really my question. I hope that this does carry forth Cleary into the future.
I just want to say one of the things that we've been doing all summer is coming up with ideas and brainstorming and thinking about next steps. And I'm really pleased to have our friends at UMass here, because what we've been doing over every meal since they got here yesterday has been developing projects for future work. If anyone wants some archaeology on their property, please let us know.
Hi, Lee Saperstein again. I want to comment on equality. Nantucket has been tolerant of its African community, but not necessarily embracing it. If we look at the ship's histories, the officers and owners were white of European extraction. The sailors in the forecastle were from everywhere. Herman Melville captured it with a Pacific Islander and a Wampanoag in the forecastle. And as a closing comment, when the Essex went down and 3 whale ships were occupied, who survived? The white Nantucketers. Who died and occasionally became food were non-Nantucketers.
Well, on that cheery note.
Thank you all for your presentations. They were very informative. Yes, I am Nidra Lee from UMass Boston, and I'm sitting here with my recent graduate student, Laura Paisley, and we are part of the archaeological team that conducted the excavations at 27 York Street, also known as the Seneca Boston Florence Higginbotham property. So it's really great to be here, exciting to see the work that is continuing, and to see your progress, and to also continue to see such a strong case be made for emerging of not just preservation, but a comprehensive preservation that also involves significant historical research and archaeological research. I think that makes a great argument for how all of those different entities come together. But I'm not gonna go on because I'm not presenting. I actually have a question about the infilling that was beginning to take place towards the late 19th and definitely 20th century. And I was wondering if you could actually speak to whether or not an argument could be made that what we're seeing with the infilling and the increased zoning of the West Monomoy area as residential property is an example of gentrification, or perhaps even an example of a form of very protracted gentrification. I know we typically think about gentrification as almost happening in, dare we say, sort of like spurts of maybe, sort of 2-3 decades, and even being a fairly recent process to some extent. But could an argument be made that we're actually looking at a process of gentrification that's spanning more than that, and actually that has its roots perhaps even going back towards the 19th century? And one that is in some ways perhaps quite noticeable because of the evidence of the infilling that you all identified.
That is a great question. Is that one still on? I don't hear this.
I would say yes. And I think for us being here on Nantucket for the summer was such a crash course in what year-round residents have seen, in the way that the seasonal economy and the vacation industry has been on warp speed in Nantucket. And as plenty of my colleagues discussed, it's not a new thing to have summer visitors, but the pace has accelerated, as Sullivan showed in her presentation, although she was showing like within family subdivisions. I appreciate your analysis that this is like a slow moving gentrification thing that I think is accelerating, and there may be differences shifting from within family transfers and subdivisions to, it seems like, this was not really a focus of our work, but it seems like more and more off-island ownership and more investment trust ownership. So that financialization of housing being a part of this form of gentrification, that's affecting Nantucket and of course plenty of other places. But I think all of us like coming here for the summer really, really noticed that. And then looking through the deeds and seeing the recent deeds, the huge proportion of homes that are owned by LLCs, and often not single member LLCs, but investment trusts.
I also just want to say that while we've been working on this project, we've been watching a couple of projects that are under construction. One is the Oak development on York Street. We're looking at it going, oh, we wish we could have gotten inside. We wish we could have seen what it was. We wish we could have done more research, beforehand, which is why it's so important to do this, as Holly is shaking her head. And the second is Linda's property on Silver Street, which when we started this work, we had multiple people reach out to us and say, please look at this property. It seems to be an early remnant that we really need to be looking at and need to be studying. As we noted, the neighborhood's built out. We've got like 5 open blocks left for infill. And what happens to the rest? Do they get torn down and replaced? I think there's a serious moment here that we have to stop and ask how much preservation is actually happening on Nantucket when we have buildings being demolished without taking a pause and looking at if they are historically or culturally significant. So.
Well, and I also think we saw this happen with Mariah and Nick's presentation, where there has already been a lot of demolition very early on in this neighborhood. We have lost a lot of built resources that could have told us a lot about the history. And I feel like we need to learn from that mistake before it happens again. I think with that, we are actually at 12:30, so thank you all so much for being with us. Yeah, if you could. We really appreciate you sticking it out. If you want to learn more, the link to the story maps is here. It will be on our PIN website as well later. But thank you all so, so much.